You
Good to be
are
here.
in 183 neighborhoods in Oakland. That's incredible. Just to put that into perspective, that's 97% of all Oakland neighborhoods. Now, they're in 60% of all U.S. neighborhoods. So Oakland, you're 97%, and 23% of the households. So you should just move your headquarters here.
Maybe we will. Maybe we will. Hopefully we'll be successful enough to need a larger headquarters that we have in San Francisco, and then we'll certainly look around the Bay Area.
Well, I'm sure the city of Oakland would love to have you. They're very grateful. You were just here actually earlier this week because you changed some of your service to prevent racial profiling, which has been happening on the platform. But now you're going to make it more difficult for people to just post about suspicious-looking people, which I think is a great addition. But I can't imagine how difficult it was to think about what is the best way to do that. And talk about the thought process in terms of how you thought, what was the best way to actually prevent something like that?
Well, the issue that we are trying to address is not really a NextDoor issue, it's a societal issue. And that's the issue of unconscious bias and implicit bias ultimately making its way to discrimination, and in this case, racial profiling. And so neighbors use NextDoor to talk about the things that matter to them in their neighborhoods. In some cases, those things are crime and safety concerns. And when they post about potentially criminal activity or things they see that are suspicious, they need to do so in a way that avoids stereotyping an entire race of people. And so over the last couple of months, we've been really excited to work with several community groups in Oakland, the Oakland Police Department, Oakland City Administration, and then a number of the city council members, specifically Vice Mayor Annie Campbell-Washington and Council Member Desley Brooks. And we've together created a series of product changes or new product features that really drive our members towards a responsible kind of posting and ensure that the dialogue that happens on NextDoor is really constructive and neighborly.
Yeah, but it sort of raises the question, you talked about working with the city, it raises the questions of what is your responsibility? What is a social network with, I mean, clearly with a lot of influence, what is your responsibility and what is the government's responsibility? It is, as you said, it isn't really a NextDoor problem. You are amplifying what's happening in the city.
Well, NextDoor is a mission-centric company, and the mission of the company is to use the power of technology to build stronger and safer neighborhoods. And discrimination of any kind, and especially something like racial profiling, is completely counter to that mission. So we do have a responsibility to look at things on our platform, and if they're counter to our mission, do something about them. Now, in regards to how much can we control, we can't control, broadly speaking, what people do in their neighborhoods, but we are a mirror of those conversations in Oakland and in many parts of the country. As you mentioned, we have over 60% of the country's neighborhoods using NextDoor, but in the top 100 cities, it's over 90% of those cities' neighborhoods. And so we tend to be a mirror of the conversations that are going on in these neighborhoods. And if we can use technology to try to educate people and make them aware of things, then we have a chance to be, if not a small part of the solution, at least a positive force that moves things in the right direction.
You mentioned now, this happens to a lot of platforms. There's sort of unintended use cases, something that's counter to your mission. I read a story about how people were using NextDoor as a dating site, which I can imagine could be quite useful if you're new to the neighborhood. I don't imagine that that's what you plan NextDoor to be, but what are some of the other ways people are using NextDoor that you have just, found surprising?
Well, NextDoor is a broad platform, and it's a communications platform, and so typically what we see is neighborhoods talk on NextDoor about the things that are mattering in that neighborhood. And so if it's a neighborhood of young people, dating and social issues are a big part of what they want to discuss. If it's a neighborhood that is close to a beach, then you're going to have people talking about surfing. If it's a neighborhood that has lots of pet owners, you're going to see lots of posts about pets. What we typically say is we haven't seen anything that would lead us to believe that a particular kind of neighborhood is more likely to use NextDoor. In fact, now with over 90% penetration, as I mentioned, in the top 100 cities, we know that a communications tool like NextDoor will work everywhere. But what the neighborhoods talk about is different. In neighborhoods in Florida where the neighborhood may be made up primarily of senior citizens, there are conversations about their needs, the needs of retirees. In areas of the country where there are tornadoes, there were just some tragic tornadoes in Colorado, you'll have a lot of conversation about inclement weather. And so what we've seen with NextDoor is, as technology has become a dominant part of our lives, we have lost that sense of going outside our front doors and talking with our neighbors. And we've spent more times looking at our screens, in some cases, than we have looking out into our neighborhoods. And so then using technology to make it easier for us to reconnect to the people in our neighborhoods and bring back a sense of community, we have a saying, when neighbors start talking, good things happen. And that's something that we've seen over and over and over again on NextDoor.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, how you're helping neighbors sort of mobilize the community and have a voice, but I want to ask that later. I do want to mention that I am on NextDoor and in Tahoe, and our community is all about bears. So the latest message I got was removing bears from the neighborhood. So all the neighbors are trying to figure out how to get rid of the bears because there's a bear problem there. They're super nice bears.
We don't support profiling against bears, by the way, Bambi. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, in Tahoe, you're going to get those messages about the wildlife in the area, and it is a wonderful tool to quickly get all of the neighbors together talking about the issues that matter.
Yeah, no, it's great. It keeps me aware of what is happening. It almost feels like somebody's watching over my house. But the other thing I also get on NextDoor, I get welcome emails all the time. It's welcome Bob, welcome Jane, and thinking, you must get new members. I mean, this is just in my little neighborhood in Tahoe. How many members are you signing up every day?
Well, I mean, we have millions of neighbors that are using the service really every day, probably every couple of hours. And yet the funny thing is, we've been around for 5 years, and the growth was very slow in the early days. And so today, we're sort of blown away by the fact that every single day, at least 100 new neighborhoods adopt NextDoor as a communications platform.
Wow, every day 100 new neighborhoods adopt the platform. And just tell everybody how a neighborhood is created.
Well, on NextDoor, every neighborhood is a distinct geographic shape. So there are neighborhood boundaries. The neighborhoods don't overlap, so the neighborhood boundaries all fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And when you come to NextDoor, you have to enter your address, because one of the things that's very unique about NextDoor is it's a private social network. You have to enter your address and then verify where you live, and if you do that, you then receive access to your neighborhood. Now, if no one has started NextDoor in your area, you have the opportunity to do that, and that's the 100 new neighborhoods I'm talking about. But it's not just you joining. When you join and you put in your address, if there isn't a neighborhood in your area, you can choose to start the neighborhood, which entails filling out an application, telling us why you should be the right person to start the neighborhood, and then drawing the boundary, naming the neighborhood, and finally, and most importantly, in the first 21 days, getting 9 of the neighbors in that neighborhood to join the service and all verify their addresses. Now, 9 doesn't sound like a lot. Plus you, it's 10 people. It doesn't sound like a lot. But today, or at least I guess when we started the company, the statistic was almost 30% of Americans could not name a single neighbor by name, not even one. And so if you can imagine, we sit here with our phones, and if you need to invite 100 of your friends to a party, you can go to Facebook and you can make one post and 1,000 of your friends can see it, right? Or you can actually maybe go to Gmail and you can easily find 100 people. But how many people do you know that live around you? And then beyond knowing them, how many people do you have email addresses for that live around you? What we've seen from the Pew Institute is that typically only 2% of one's Facebook friends are also their neighbors. So it's harder than you think to even get 10 neighbors to come together and join a new service, and we're seeing that over and over again.
What's the average number of neighbors in across all of your neighborhoods?
We don't talk about the averages in that way, because what we've seen is the neighborhoods that started, say, in 2012, when we were early on, those are all the largest neighborhoods, because these neighborhoods all grow progressively over time. And so I think what we have said, I have a couple of my comms folks in the audience, so I have to be careful about what they will allow me to divulge. But I do know that for the 2012 cohort of neighborhoods, we have about 40% of the households in those neighborhoods that are using NextDoor. So after some period of time, we start to have tremendous penetration.
So 40% of the households in those like hundreds and largest cities are on
Are using NextDoor.
Nextdoor.
Very frequent basis. I mean, we also have a very strong engagement model, and so I think on the order of 70% of our registered members use the service at least once a week. And so you can't really just join NextDoor and then do nothing, because immediately you join, you're part of a neighborhood, the neighborhood has conversation, and you want to be in the know. You want to hear the things that are going on, whether it's something that you absolutely need to know, like a bear is on the loose, or something that's actually maybe a little bit more conversational about a barbecue that's happening over the weekend, or someone wants to borrow a cup of sugar or needs a recommendation for a babysitter.
Right. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about the engagement and the model, because you have such a growing big community. But I do also want to go back a little bit, because we want to talk about sort of lessons learned. And you are establishing several hundred or 100 neighborhoods a day.
So it's at least 100 new neighborhoods a day.
A day, okay.
But to put that into context, the first year of NextDoor,
Right.
we had 176 neighborhoods total in that first year. And I tell a story to the company where the first summer that we had the product out, we had maybe a dozen neighborhoods that were using the service. And we went to the company and said, look, we need to do something ambitious this summer to show that this really has the kind of reach that we want it to have, that it can be truly mainstream. And so we designed this thing called the Dim Sum 100. And we told everyone in the company, okay, look, I know we only have a dozen neighborhoods today, but if we can figure out a way to get 100 new neighborhoods to adopt the service over the entire summer, then we'll bring in a dim sum cart, and everyone can enjoy dim sum. And I remember the engineers looking at me like I was crazy. My God, it's taken us 6 months to get 12 neighborhoods. How can we ever get 100 in a summer? We actually did end up getting the 100 in the summer, and then of course now it's 100 a day. So I think the lesson there for me is, you can choose to focus on quantity or you can choose to focus on quality. Rarely can you focus on both at the same time. If you focus on quantity, it's fine. You're trying to actually grow as quickly as possible. You're trying to get the largest user base as quickly as possible. But you may lose a lot of that audience. You may have a lot of churn. And that may be okay, because you actually want to establish awareness, or you want to get people to start trial, and then you think you'll get them back at some point. The other way of doing it is you can say, look, it's not about absolute numbers on day one, or even day 100, because the absolute numbers are going to be low. It's about quality. It's about making sure that you have strong product to market fit. And when you're observing a small group at the beginning, you have the insight and you have, frankly, the ability to study that community or that user base so carefully that you can really understand what's going on and make changes. And once you make those changes, you can start to say, okay, now we have strong product market fit. Now let's figure out, are there parts of the product that we can make automatic or self-fulfilling through technology that will then enable us to scale much more quickly.
Well, it seems like the 12 to the 100 was probably maybe one of the hardest. So what was it that you did? Did you target active, active neighbors, or who are those presidents of the homeowners association?
We did a lot of those things, but NextDoor has grown almost, I would say, solely through word of mouth. I mean, the conversations on NextDoor are private, so you won't encounter them in a Google search. We have no SEO, we have no SEM, we've done no advertising. And there were enough people we found that were interested in starting a new neighborhood, but could you make that easy for them? So the big thing that we did over the summer was to develop an automated way for any user to come to the website. And at that point, most users who joined needed to start their neighborhood. And we developed a system where they could just draw a free-form shape, and we would snap it into a polygon that would then represent the map of the neighborhood. Whereas before, it was extremely laborious just to get the actual shape of the neighborhood done. In many cases, my co-founders and I would literally be on the phone with these people saying, okay, I'm looking at a map. Now tell me, where does this boundary go? It's at the intersection of this street and then it goes maybe 6 blocks in this direction, and then it comes down, and then we'd have to talk to other people that would join early to make sure that that boundary was the right boundary. And all of those things that we were doing manually in an unscalable way, we've systematically used technology to create an automated mechanism to do those things.
Well, that's a good lesson, and Oshin brought that up as well earlier. I mean, everything is manual, everything is tedious, everything is hard, and that's why you are where you are, because you did that work and then eventually automated it.
It's sort of it's an interesting, almost counterintuitive insight. And the expression I've heard is to do scalable things, start by doing unscalable things. And you sort of think to yourself, in Silicon Valley, everything's about scale, get big fast. We have these giant global audiences. Facebook is serving over 1 billion people a day. But even Facebook started very manually, college by college, right? I mean, first, Facebook was only available at Harvard, and that's it. And that was a relatively small audience. It was probably an audience of thousands, if not hundreds.
I think you got
right?
70,000 users in 2 months, so
Yeah,
pretty quick.
Right.
Fast growing. So let's talk about the usage of your site, because you had 100 the first year, but for some reason the last 18 months it just seems like you've accelerated. You have a ton of momentum. You've raised a ton of money. You have a huge valuation, and now you have a large community, and to use the word I guess everybody uses is to monetize. And one of the ways you and I talked about earlier about what you can do is potentially advertising, because you have such a local community and local advertisers, which is pretty tough to attract. So when you go to, or when you sort of position yourselves for that, why do you think you would be a good place for local advertisers, and what kind are we talking about?
Well, we're a social network, and if we look at sort of the giants whose shoulders we stand on, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram, they all monetize through advertising. And so that has been something that we have had a fairly strong sense of from the very beginning. A free product for consumers, but something that ultimately monetizes because advertisers want access to those consumers. In our case, we think the opportunity is incredible, because by and large, local businesses cannot use existing social platforms to reach their customers. If you're a dentist, if you're an architect, if you're a contractor, if you're a plumber, a babysitter, etc., Facebook is not really that useful to you, because you're not trying to get scale of leads, and you need to really target based on a strict geographic service area. Twitter is something, again, the scale is too big. Google, you have to wait for people to have intent, and once they have intent, there's a lot of competition for those search ads on the right side. And so if we go back to some of the more traditional ways that local businesses would get themselves noticed, it was the yellow pages. It was local newspapers, local radio, local television. And most of those mediums, if not all of them, have declined over time as people have adopted the internet as the way they get information. But if you think about it, we're still very early in our usage of internet technologies to get information on local. It's sort of ironic, because in many ways, the local information is the most valuable, but that information you talk about where you have a bear on the loose in Tahoe, how could you find that on Facebook? How could you find that on Google? How could you find that even on NewYorkTimes.com? It's just not the way we think of the internet today, or isn't the way we've thought about it. So we can occupy a place, we believe, that allows local businesses to connect with local communities in a way that makes sense for them, that they don't really have with the Facebooks of the world.
Right, but there are the Yelps of the world, or the Handys, the TaskRabbits now, and they're all going for local providers, whether it's TaskRabbit and Handy going for the local cleaner and plumber, or Yelp for the local restaurant and for the local dentist or doctor. So what is the value proposition to the doctor or the dentist, say, over Yelp, and then to the plumber or the other handymen that are using TaskRabbit and some of these other services?
So I think at the end of the day, NextDoor is actually pretty simple. It's a place you go to discover what your neighbors think is important. And it's that simple. And so if you're looking for a neighbor recommendation on a handyman, a plumber, a doctor, a restaurant, etc., NextDoor is the place that you want to go. If you believe that the best place to get restaurant reviews is a thriving community like Yelp, then by all means you should go to Yelp, because we can't provide that same experience. The experience that we can provide, however, is a private place where you can ask your neighbors to recommend a service provider or a service in general that you would find valuable. And that to us is a very different value proposition. Even thinking about Amazon, which really pioneered the notion of user-generated content around reviews, and it was product reviews for them, those are hugely valuable. You want to buy a book or you want to buy anything, you read the reviews, but you don't know the people behind those reviews. The sole value proposition of NextDoor, and we think it's an immensely powerful one, is that you know all the content is created by your actual neighbors. And we feel that's different.
Yeah, that is different because now I'm starting to have a relationship with my neighbors, and I can see how that referral could start happening more organically than maybe some of the other services where you have to go in there and make a selection yourself.
Well, what ends up happening is neighborhoods are not chosen by people by accident. We choose the neighborhoods we want to live in because we feel like those are the neighborhoods that we belong in, either because we think the people are like us or the proximity to certain things, whether they're churches, schools, some kind of outdoor activity, or even work, whether those proximities make sense to us. And so we end up living with people that are a lot like us. And so they are well positioned to give us advice when we have needs because in many cases they've had the same needs.
Well, I have to say, I am a big fan of NextDoor because it is such a great community service, and I know, and hopefully there could be something economic or some sort of formal partnership you can have with local governments because I think they find your service so useful. But I did want to ask one question. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this is such a fascinating question for Nirav because I don't know how many people know this, but he built a company, raised $5 million, had 15 million users for his company called Fanbase. It was a sports almanac. And after having 15 million users, most of us would probably say, hey, we're doing great. He decided to switch gears. That must have been really tough to switch gears and then start this company. So one, how did you get the nerve to switch gears, or why would you do that? And how do you go from sports almanac to a neighborhood?
That's a good question. So NextDoor is a pivot, what we call in Silicon Valley a pivot. It's really a company that was created out of a failed company called Fanbase. And Fanbase had 15 million users, but it was sort of the way I described early on. It was all about quantity, not quality. So it had 15 million users who came in, and probably all 15 million left and didn't want to come back. And so we noticed pretty early that while we'd figured out a way to get people to the front door, we hadn't figured out a way to get people to stay. And once we realized that and tried to do a number of things to change that and couldn't, we realized that long-term there was really no value proposition. Now, interestingly, there were a lot of similarities between Fanbase and NextDoor. Certainly not in subject area, sports versus neighborhoods. But Fanbase was all about user-generated content. It was all about using community power or utilizing sports fans to create content. The same way NextDoor is all about utilizing neighborhood communities to create that content. So most of my career is spent in the area of online community and user-generated content, and it's an area that I deeply believe in. So whether it's in sports or neighborhoods or what I did previously, which was product reviews, that's sort of where I'm staying.
Well, and you're a true entrepreneur. You've had successes, you've had failures, but you haven't had those failures set you back. In fact, you came back, charging back, and now you have this empire. So, and a very community-focused, oriented service, which I think even Mitch Kapor would say is actually having a social impact. So, thanks very much, Nirav, for taking the time, and Nirav Tolia, everyone.
Thank you.